This is the Lesson 4 Read Aloud, Abraham Lincoln. It was a cool October morning in the year 1858. In a town called Alton in Illinois, workers were putting the finishing touches on a wooden platform in front of a crowd at City Hall. A sharp, cold breeze rustled through the trees, sending showers of crisp red and yellow leaves fluttering through the air. Two of these men in the crowd were old friends, although they had not seen one another for a long time. One was a farmer. He was dusty after driving his horse and buggy all the way to town on the dirt roads. The other man lived in town. He was dressed in a clean gray suit. "Good to see you, Frank. How is your farm doing, and how was the corn crop this year?" "Oh, it could have been better. The rains came a little late, but it was good enough, I suppose," Frank said, brushing dust from his jacket. He looked around at the faces in the crowd. "You know, Tom, I suppose it has been a lot longer than I thought since I have been to town, because I hardly recognize a single face in this crowd." "That's because most of these people are not from here," Tom said. "I was just talking to a man from Kentucky, and I met others who said they had crossed the river from Missouri this morning. It seems odd to me that so many people are so eager to come and listen to two politicians from Illinois." "There's nothing strange about it," said another man who was standing nearby. "Forgive me for interrupting, but I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. I'm William Foote, owner of the Daily Pantagraph newspaper out of Bloomington. I'll tell you, gentlemen, these two politicians are going to talk about a problem that impacts our entire country, from here to Boston and all the way to Texas. That is why people from outside Illinois are so interested in what they have to say." "Well, I'll tell you what I think, Mr. Foote," said Tom. "People should have the right to decide for themselves whether slavery should be allowed in their own state. This includes whether it is allowed to expand to new states like Kansas or remain in an old state like ours in Illinois." "That's not how Mr. Lincoln sees things," said Mr. Foote. "Lincoln says that he does not see how the United States can survive for much longer if slavery is allowed in half the country and forbidden in the other half." "We will see about that," said Tom. "Our nation and its government have survived since July 4th, 1776, and slavery has been there all along. And we will all be fine as long as the abolitionists quit trying to tell everyone else all over the country what to do. Don't you agree, Frank?" Frank thought for a minute and rubbed his chin. "Honestly, I'm not really sure, Tom. I think this Lincoln fellow might have a good point when he says that slavery is tearing our country apart. But what do I know? That is why I have come here today, to try to get a better understanding." "Well, you will not be disappointed," said Mr. Foote. "I have been to each of their 6 previous debates, or discussions, this one being the 7th and last before the Senate election next month, and I can tell you that you will not find two men who disagree more on the issue of whether slavery should be allowed to expand." Should slavery be allowed to expand in new states? That was the true heart of the debate. In 1858, when he was running for the Senate, Abraham Lincoln said he just wanted to stop slavery from spreading to new areas of the country in the West. In other words, Lincoln did not support abolishing or ending slavery where it already existed in the South. At that time, the United States was made up of the North, where slavery was illegal or not allowed by law, and the South, where slavery was legal or allowed by law. The United States was only just beginning to grow into a bigger country, spreading west across the Mississippi River. That wide and mighty river, flowing from Minnesota all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, ran right past the town of Alton. Just across the river was the state of Missouri, which had only been a state since 1821. Slavery was legal in Missouri, as it was in the nearby state of Kentucky, but slavery was illegal in Illinois. There was a lot of land beyond Missouri, but there were not many states, at least not yet. A huge portion of that land, which had previously belonged to Native American tribes, was still divided into U.S. territories. These territories had governments of their own, but they were not yet states. The Kansas Territory was one example. Lots of people were moving west to settle in Kansas, and it was on its way to becoming a new state. The people of Kansas would be able to vote on whether or not to allow slavery to expand to their new state. However, the people in Kansas were divided on the issue of slavery. They were so divided, in fact, that the Kansas Territory was known for its severe fighting over whether slavery should be allowed. At last, the two candidates, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, appeared on the stage. The crowd applauded and then settled down to listen to the debate. Both men had become rather famous over the past few months, not just in Illinois and surrounding states, but all over the country. The Lincoln-Douglas debates had been covered in newspapers as far away as Boston, New York, and Atlanta, for these two men represented two very different sides of the slavery issue. Stephen Douglas was a short, plump man and a great speaker. He believed, as did Tom, that the problem of slavery should be solved by each state and not by the U.S. government. In other words, each state should decide whether to make slavery legal or illegal, and that the U.S. government should not have no say over the issue. Lincoln, on the other hand, thought the U.S. government had a right to prevent and spread the spread of slavery to new parts of the country. The people of the South, especially those who supported slavery, did not like Lincoln for his belief in the power of the U.S. government over the power of the states. They worried that one day the U.S. government might try to tell the South what to do, especially that the government might tell them to abolish slavery. Lincoln had a reputation of being a powerful and very intelligent man. He was born on a Kentucky farm, but moved to Indiana and then to Illinois, where he was raised in a one-room cabin. Young Lincoln spent his days working on the farm. He only went to school for a year or two as a child. Nevertheless, he became what is known as self-educated. He read everything he could get his hands on, and by the time he was an adult, he had more knowledge than most people who had attended school for many years. Lincoln eventually taught himself about law, and he became a well-known lawyer in Illinois. Despite his reputation for strength and intelligence and his uncommonly tall, thin body, people were always surprised when Lincoln opened his mouth. Lincoln had a high-pitched, squeaky voice, not the sort of voice people expected to hear. But it was always worthwhile to hear what he had to say. "What is it that we hold most dear amongst us?" Lincoln asked the crowd that day in Alton. "It is our freedom and wealth. And what has ever threatened our freedom and wealth except this institution of slavery? If this be true, how will we improve things by expanding slavery, by spreading it out and making it bigger?" How, Lincoln asked, could America continue to be one united nation if it allowed slavery to spread to new states? Mr. Foote, the newspaper man, looked around at the faces in the crowd, and he could tell that Lincoln was winning the debate. More people liked what he had to say. Even those who were not against slavery or did not think that it was wrong would have a hard time trying to prove that it was not tearing the country apart. In an earlier speech, Lincoln said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." In other words, could a country continue when the government in some places in the country allowed slavery and the government in other places prohibited it? As it turned out, Stephen Douglas was truly a powerful politician. He ended up winning the Senate seat, but Abraham Lincoln had definitely brought attention to himself. These two men met again for 2 years later as both campaigned to become President of the United States. That race had a very different ending.